Hello, viewer. If you are watching this video as the last layer of the Computing Information Disorder project, I thank you for your patience. I know it took a while to get here. I chose to do this final layer as a video because I think the information is communicated a lot better through diagrams. And what we're going to be talking about, oh, you can hear my dog in the background there. Hey, quiet, buddy. What we're going to be talking about is Russian information confrontation, and you might be wondering why I keep calling it that. So I threw this slide in here just to put this code up on the screen. This is taken from an excellent document from 2014. It was written by Peter Pomerantsev and Michael Weiss. Peter Pomerantsev, if you don't know, is one of the lead he's a journalist, but he's one of the lead thinkers in this area. And they quote this guy, Rear Admiral Vladimir Perumov, I think that's how you say his name, who wrote a book called Information Confrontation in 2010. The Russian titles at the top there. And I just threw this in here to show this is a very sophisticated strategy. I'm not making this up. I'm just trying to figure it out. And the way Rear Admiral Perumov defines information confrontation is securing national policy objectives both in wartime and in peacetime through means and techniques of influencing the information resources of the opposing side, and it includes influences on an enemy's information system and psychic condition. And he goes on to specify that particular information influence techniques he's talking about include disinformation, deception, manipulation, propaganda, conversion, separation, demoralization, desertion, captivity, lobbying, crisis control, and blackmail. So kind of a greatest hits list of all the worst ways you could think of implementing foreign policy. So I just wanted to make it clear because the war in Ukraine, I think, has highlighted to those of us in democratic countries that Russia's figured out controlling the narrative better than we have, and we're not really sure what to do about it. This is a really sophisticated strategy. They've been developing it for over 100 years. It's not new. In fact, there are narratives about, denazifying countries and finding weapons of mass destruction. That goes back at least 80 years. They've been beating the same drums for 8 decades now, and it's not new. Unfortunately, most of the literature that's written by the military and intelligence services, and especially the general staff, is still in Russian. So the reason I had to find this quote in an English document is because that book, Information Confrontation, has never been translated into English. Okay, so moving right along, I'm going to get started here. This project. The idea was to use computational thinking to explain information disorder. So I'm going to try and use this whole slide deck kind of as one big decomposition diagram to show how decomposition and pattern recognition and eventually layered modeling can sort of explain problems in a very solvable way. So to start off with this layered model, we're going to look at what are the components of a nation state. And I'm taking this from generally accepted theory of international relations and international law. Basically, a nation state needs to have 4 components to be a legitimate nation state. So it's got to have its territory, which is its geographical area that is bounded. It's got to have a population, and that population needs to recognize that state as its legitimate state, or its legitimate government. And it has to have authority structures. So by authority structures, I mean the obvious things like police, law enforcement, military. But more importantly, is it has to have electoral processes that perpetuate the legitimacy of that state. And then finally, it's got to have recognition from internal and external audiences. And what I mean by that is, like I said, the citizens of the state, the internal audience need to recognize that they are part of that country, that they recognize themselves. So, for example, I'm Canadian. I recognize myself as Canadian. But then they also need to be recognized in some way by the international community. Generally, we take that to mean the United Nations, but that's not always the case. And we're seeing how those international institutions and their legitimacy, if they get eroded, the recognition by the international community can become a significant problem. We're especially seeing that problem in eastern Ukraine right now. Okay, so I threw this, this is called a tactical mission graphic. In the military, we use these on maps. It's the symbol for guard. So I just threw this on here to say that in addition to those 4 components of the nation state, they also have to guard those 4 components. And if they can't protect themselves, they will cease to be a nation state. Okay, the next layer is what's called the DIME model. DIME stands for Diplomacy, Information, Military, and Economics. I don't like this model. It's not great, but it's an example of in computational thinking how you don't really need the perfect abstraction. You just need the one that kind of gets the job done. So the DIME model is a model of understanding the instruments of national power. It's a very Western-focused idea. I think China recognizes 22 different instruments of national power, and I'm sure Russia recognizes a lot as well. But typically in Western democratic liberal democracy countries, we kind of divide all of national power into these four categories. The one we're going to be looking at today specifically is information. So in democratic countries, the reason information is such an important lever of national power is we need to preserve the collective and individual agency of our citizens to the highest extent possible. So we have to set conditions in the information environment so that all citizens, for example, citizens of Canada, are rational actors who are self-determining, can make their own decisions, can decide how they feel about what's going on in their country. In authoritarian regimes, it's the complete opposite, right? So they're out to diminish individual agency such that it's not a threat to existing power structures. How this is done and how we preserve those conditions in the information environment is a sticky thing, because nobody likes when they hear their the members of their military or their security services talking about the information space. So my favorite example of this is, in Canada, we have a very, very broad and very high quality education, an educational system, and we kind of take making sure that educational system stays fair and equal across the board very, very seriously. That's not the case in many countries around the world. Okay, and so this layer here is where things start to get a bit more tangible. So when we talk about collective and individual agency is very obvious. Collective agency is less obvious. But if you think, the right to assembly or the right to form political action groups, that is a type of collective agency, right? It's a type of banding together. And both as individuals and as organizations, we need to be able to do these four activities, these four activities are how individuals and organizations interact with information. They collect, process, protect, and project information. Collect is fairly obvious. You need to get information to make informed decisions. You need to process it. So this is easier to explain at the collective level. So process information, think of a bureaucratic process. Think of filling out a form to get a passport. That system has to be in place for you to have your right to travel. It's less obvious at the individual level, and I'm going to come back to why that's important. But what we've been looking at throughout this computing information disorder project, information disorder attacks your individual capability to process information. And then the last two, protect and project, I won't spend too much time on, but protect, the best example I can think of protect as an information activity is kind of the crisis we're seeing going on with data and data security, and how compromised our democratic processes can be both individually and collectively if our data is compromised. And if you've been paying attention for the last, what is it now, 6-7 years, about the scandals going on with organizations like Cambridge Analytica, protecting your data is becoming really, really important. And then project. So project, the best example I like to give of how you project information, right, how you act on information, is voting, right? So voting, it's a subjective decision, but it has huge objective consequences for the rest of society, and it's a very important, it's a right and a duty, in my opinion, to project your vote. Okay, here's where Rick enters the picture. So Rick enters mis, dis, and malinformation into those four information activities, and I'm going to focus mostly on the process activity. So the reason the Kremlin does this is to trigger emotional responses at the individual level. So for most of the Cold War, this strategy was called active measures. And the thing that was activated was emotions, and specifically negative emotions. The reason for that is because if I trigger emotions in you such as distrust, shame, hatred, apathy, fear, rage, all these things, you are far more likely to take action against the components of your own nation state. So this is what RIC is. This is Russian Information Confrontation. So now I'll talk specifically about how they do it, how RIC works. Um, it's through what I call targeted epidemiology, because I honestly believe information, especially disordered information, spreads epidemiologically through a population. Um, I will say though, this is a model that I am proposing. I don't have any secret handbook for how this is done. This is me trying to make sense of all the research that I've done. That said, though, the model that I'm proposing can be thought of as a step-by-step guide to weaponizing a population against itself. Okay, so step one, segment the target population. So if you look at the diagram on your screen there and imagine this represents the population of Canada, you want to divide them up into the white zone, gray zone, and black zone audience. Your white zone audience is people who benefit from the status quo and are generally happy. Your black zone audience on the right side there, ideally this group will always be getting smaller. These are people who have legitimate disagreements with the status quo, and those disenfranchising issues can be historical. So if you think about the historical tensions between French and English Canada, or the sufferings of Indigenous Canadians, but they can also be economic or political. So there's always going to be people who benefit from certain trade policies and those that don't. So those issues that could potentially fracture a population, they do exist and they are real, and that's going to become important in a second. So then your gray zone audience in the middle, that's kind of the rest of us. That's those of us who, we don't really think about the status quo too much. We just sort of live our lives, and when there's an election, we decide how we feel about it, and we make a decision one way or the other. The goal in a functioning democracy is always to move as many people out of the black zone and the gray zone audience and into the white zone. So how we do that in a democratic country is through what I call narratives of productive disagreement. So you can think of this as the democratization of information. This is why we have to take those information activities very seriously, and we prevent those issues from fracturing our society through things like the rules-based international order, liberalism, democracy. As I said, my favorite's education, and then in our country there's some uniquely Canadian ones too, about tolerance, multiculturalism. These are all narratives that help us work towards better outcomes as a whole. So here's how Rick attacks those narratives. They do what I call inject what I call venomous voices, and we'll get to what those are later on. But the goal there is basically to just speak to the black zone audience. The goal is not to speak to everyone. The goal is just to speak to those people that have those legitimate gripes. So it's quite cynical how they do this. What they do is they pick out people they consider useful idiots, and this is a term that goes way back into the Cold War. I'm not even sure how old it is. I think it might go back to Lenin. But they amplify useful idiots. These are people who are willing to kind of step up and take a leadership role in that black zone audience. It's important to recognize when they're doing this, the venomous voices that are speaking to these useful idiots, at first they're just speaking to them about their issue. They're just throwing fuel and emotional fuel on their existing grievance. And they do that to grow the black zone audience, to draw attention to these issues and to get more people sort of fired up about them. And that black zone audience grows at the expense of the gray zone audience. So you're always going to have people who sort of are on the right side of the gray zone, who are more sympathetic to those issues, and they can be pushed one way or the other on the fence. So then, once the venomous voices have got a good understanding of the sociocultural context of these divisive political issues, then they start weaponizing what I call narratives of destructive disagreement. So they kind of figure out how can they leverage these existing grievances to start sowing fear and distrust and all the negative emotions that I talked about earlier. And a big one that I'll point out near the bottom there is apathy. Apathy is huge, especially in the black zone audience. Apathy is basically the strategy of just convincing people not to take part in their own democratic processes, convincing people it's not worth your time to go vote, It's not worth your time taking the kind of historical national narratives that you hear about in school. It's not worth it taking those seriously. So the goal there is to sort of marry these negative emotional experiences to the existing issues within the Black Zone audience. So here's where the real sleight of hand comes in. This is what I call laundering weaponized narratives. Once once the venomous voices have, you know, leaders that they can leaders within the Black Zone audience who are from that culture and from that sociocultural context, then they can start using them as sock puppets to speak these weaponized narratives on their behalf, right? So they don't want the narratives linked to, say, a Russian state-backed media outlet. They want them linked to legitimate Canadian voices. And the goal there is to get that target audience to start pursuing self-destructive behaviors or political actions that will make productive disagreements impossible. So the example that I give, and it's very alive and real right now, especially to me because I live in downtown Ottawa. If you think about the trucker convoy that set off from BC earlier this year, you know, the narrative was quite clear what they were doing when they left, right? They were upset about a specific government policy about crossing the border and not being vaccinated. And the convoy was a protest to drive to Ottawa and protest that specific policy. The goal from the point of view of the venomous voices is to kind of do a judo flip on that legitimate political protest till it just becomes just one big cesspool of anger and rage and hatred and distrust and conspiracy theories and whatnot, to the point where you have people standing in front of Parliament calling for the overthrow of Parliament. So that's not a productive disagreement. There is no way to have a rational debate about that, the same way there would be to have a rational debate about a specific policy regarding an industry. So what the venomous voices want to do is make sure that they're not seen as the ones that are speaking these weaponized narratives. They want to launder them. So once that process has happened, and you have the useful idiots kind of taking the leadership role, the goal from the perspective of the venomous voices is just to aggravate polarization. And this can be done through these more sort of informational, psychological ways we've been talking about, but you can also start talking about technical means. So amplifying the voices within the target population that are speaking the weaponized narratives. And the goal with that is just to give some legitimacy to what I call feelings of generalized misery, right? So there's just this idea within the target population that everyone's upset all the time and they're not really sure why or what to do about it. Once that generalized misery is sort of set in, then they can start amplifying pessimists within the gray zone audience. So people who, you know, they used to not think about it very much, how the status quo was treating them, and now they start to look around and say to themselves, hey, yeah, maybe I am getting screwed over by the way things are. So once that happens, then from the perspective of Rick, they've really started to tip the scale. Whereas before we had, you know, a fairly substantial portion of people in the white zone audience, and they are probably still there at this time. And the black zone audience was quite small. Now, once they've reached this tipping point is when this is when things start to get really, really hard to reverse. So once that scale has been tipped, the odds are that some of those original useful idiots who were just speaking to a small disenfranchised audience, you know, several months or years ago, they now become emboldened and feel more confident to step out into the mainstream and start speaking the laundered, weaponized narratives into the broader public. The measure of effectiveness for Russian information confrontation at this point of the game is to try and get a homegrown venomous voice to step out into mainstream political and social life and start speaking their narratives to the broader public. So once there's one of these homegrown little screamy face emojis, that's when the gray zone really starts to grow, because your average person can't make sense of kind of what's happening anymore. And they, even if they didn't have any of those legitimate disenfranchising grievances in the past, they now become so acutely aware of how much conflict is going on in their own society they can't really make sense of how to feel about it. And then once this happens, once the gray zone and the black zone audience significantly outnumber the white zone audience, is when serious charges or condemnations can come against what I call the white zone elites. So they're the people who they probably do benefit from the status quo, or sorry, they do benefit from the status quo, and they probably are doing nefarious things to keep themselves benefiting from the status quo and not others. And they are very susceptible to this kind of attack. So you're probably asking yourself, how do you stop this from happening? So as a military thinker, I would say the first step is to remember who the bad guys are. The venomous voices are the bad guys. All of these people, regardless of how you or I feel about their, whatever it is their issue, whatever it is that upsets them so much, or if they've been manipulated by Russian information confrontation, these people are all your fellow citizens. They're not the bad guys. However, we should definitely be getting rid of these guys. We have to shut them up, sever their funding, and attack their command and control. But that's only kind of the supply side issue of the problem. There's a demand side too. Let's go back to the original slide with the segmentation of the target population. We should be focusing on using our democratic narratives to resolve the issues that create the black zone audience in the first place. If there were no black zone audience, there would be nobody for the venomous voices to target. Okay, so you might be, at this point, you might be thinking I sound like just another crazy conspiracy theorist. But I'm going to show you some of these venomous voices that I'm talking about. So this is a chart created by Maburo, who are a kind of a disinformation, I think not for profit. They've done a few iterations of this, but they try to keep track of sort of which news outlets or which social media outlets are affiliated with the Russian intelligence and security services, and they also track Russian state-backed media. So I would draw your attention to a couple of them on here. So two that are really relevant in 2022. On the right side there is this organization called globalresearch.ca, and in the bottom left-hand corner is Russia Today, or they just call themselves RT now. There was an RT Canada outlet until recently. And this is a screen grab from globalresearch.ca's landing page. I put this on here because I did mention them in an earlier layer where we talked about a specific piece of disinformation that was circulating during the early days of the pandemic. And I wanted you to see this. So this is what a venomous voice looks like. This is what a disinformation super spreader looks like. This site offends me personally and professionally on numerous levels, and especially the intelligence spooks who back it. But I will put in a personal aside here. I'm a bit of a computer nerd, and I can tell you, dear viewer, if you are ever on a website that has 13 buttons in their banner ribbon and this many columns, if you see web design that bad, don't even ask yourself if it's disinformation. Just don't let them put any information into your brain. Just ignore it. Navigate to a different site. And so here's a screen grab of RT Canada's page before it got taken down. As you can see, RT definitely does a better job of kind of sprinkling in their, let's say, more motivated articles with, stuff that is more accurate to the sociocultural context. So you see an article about hockey above an article that calls our Prime Minister Two-Face Justin Trudeau has betrayed Canada. So not as heavy-handed as the previous site, but still, there you go. So I will say this issue is very alive in 2022, obviously, and I do feel we as a country, Canada, have woken up a bit more to what's going on. I don't think we understand yet how sophisticated Russian information confrontation actually is. Sorry. But I will say that, so this report came out from Disinfo Digest in February. This was specifically about how RT, which is a Russian state-backed news media organization, RT Canada, it explains how they were exploiting the trucker protest to promote and legitimize anti-government narratives. Anti-government narratives is I guess the more accepted term for what I call narratives of destructive disagreement. And so, sorry, I'm getting close to wrapping up here. I just wanted to throw this in. This is developing. This was developing while I was doing this project, while I was doing this research. The CRTC did shut down RT Canada on March 16th there, which was obviously the right thing to do, but it was 20 days after a military invasion, an illegal invasion of Ukraine started. So 20 days after the war started, CRTC finally got wise that maybe we can't trust these RT guys. And I don't say that as a slight against CRTC. I say that as a demonstration of how hard it is to detect Russian information confrontation and how hard it is to recognize when you are suffering from one of its attacks. So credit to CRTC for doing the right thing, but we really need to sort of raise awareness of RIC so that we don't let a land war in Europe 3 weeks later provoke us into maybe considering that these disinformation super spreaders do not deserve the right to free speech that is fundamental to a democratic society. So that concludes the last layer and kind of my opening salvo in the Computing Information Disorder project. I thank you for your time, and I'll leave you with this one last sentiment. Russian information confrontation weaponizes disordered information to attack your brain, to sever your brain from reality. Don't let them do it.